Hey everyone, and welcome. I am absolutely thrilled to have you here for today's explainer. If you've ever found yourself totally glued to a screen, just completely captivated by a documentary about a complex aviation disaster, well, you're definitely not alone. But have you ever actually stopped to wonder how these filmmakers pull it off? How do they take an event that is, by its very nature, completely chaotic, highly technical, and deeply tragic, and somehow transform it into this gripping, respectful, and educational narrative? Well, today, we're going to unpack the specific playbook producers use to do exactly that. We're going to break down the anatomy of how these incredible stories are built right from the ground up. Okay, let's dive into this with our exact roadmap for the explainer. First, we'll look at the anatomy of aviation narratives. Then, we'll move into the highly specific four-act structure. After that, we'll analyze scripting visuals and audio, explore defining the villain, and finally, wrap things up with best practices and ethics. Starting right off with Section 1, Anatomy of Aviation Narratives, Decoding the Chaos. So, the primary challenge any documentary filmmaker faces right out of the gate is taking the raw, chaotic reality of a plane crash and building a framework that actually makes sense of it for the viewer. It's kind of like a giant puzzle. Just as investigators out in the field have to meticulously piece together physical wreckage scattered across a runway or the bottom of the ocean, filmmakers have to piece together narrative elements. They literally have to treat the storytelling structure itself like a forensic investigation. You can't just throw a giant wall of facts at the audience. You have to carefully, deliberately lay out the clues, the context, and the findings so everyone can follow along and understand exactly what went wrong. Which brings us to Section 2, the four-act structure, building the blueprint. Now, this structure right here is the precise mechanical framework producers use to organize some incredibly complex timelines into digestible phases. Act 1 is the hook or the incident. This is where we establish the context, the flight path, who the crew was, the atmosphere on board, and then bam, the moment of the event itself. Act 2 is the investigation. Here, the documentary dives into the highly technical analysis of what actually happened. Act 3 shifts focus to the search and survival, detailing the maritime search, the rescue efforts, or maybe the grueling recovery of the black boxes from the seafloor. And finally, Act 4 brings us to resolution and legacy, where we conclude with the vital lessons learned from the disaster and the safety changes that were ultimately implemented. Within that structure, and particularly when we're in Act 2, we hit the most fundamental concept of all, the chain of events. We define this as the chronological sequence of technical and human factors analyzed to figure out exactly what happened. Listen, this chain is absolutely the backbone of the entire investigative narrative. Because, as you know, it is almost never just one single thing that brings down an aircraft, right? It's a sequence, it's a domino effect. And mapping out that sequence clearly is exactly what keeps the audience engaged and informed. Moving right along to Section 3, Scripting Visuals and Audio, Constructing Tension. So how exactly do you pair visual and auditory elements to build real tension without crossing that line into feeling cheap or exploitative? And this brilliantly illustrates how that two-column script format actually works in practice. On the visual side, imagine seeing totally calm archival footage of a radar screen sweeping over the open ocean. But paired with that, the audio is this chilling narration. Flight 402 vanished from radar. No distress call, no trace. Wow, right? Next, you might have a CGI recreation of a sudden descent, but it's paired not with screaming, but with a subtle, tension-building audio drone and some distant radio static. Or a timeline graphic paired with a narrator explaining that investigators had to look beneath the surface, literally. It's this precise contrast, clinical visuals paired with atmospheric audio, that creates such a gripping experience. And then you bring in the experts. Imagine a visual of a seasoned aviation safety expert delivering this exact quote. When an aircraft impacts water, the deceleration forces are often equivalent to hitting solid concrete. I mean, wow. Delivering a visceral line like that with appropriate gravity injects massive impact right into the analytical pacing of the documentary. It completely grounds all the abstract data into a horrifying, very real physical reality. Next up is Section 4, Defining the Villain, Driving the Narrative Tension. Okay, in any compelling story, finding a villain is absolutely crucial to keep things moving forward. But here's the catch with aviation documentaries. That villain is rarely a person. Instead, producers cleverly use elements like a devastating technical malfunction or an unforgiving environment, think severe weather or a pitch-black ocean. By aiming the audience's anxieties squarely at a mechanical failure or a catastrophic storm, the narrative keeps all its intense momentum. And it does this without assigning hasty, unproven blame to the flight crew or the air traffic controllers. The investigation basically becomes this epic battle between human ingenuity and the villain of physics and circumstance. And that naturally leads us to our final section, Best Practices and Ethics, the filmmaker's guardrails. Handling stories that involve the tragic loss of human life requires a really profound sense of ethical responsibility. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the delicate tightrope producers have to walk literally every single second of the film. On one side, you have the absolute need to balance emotion by including personal accounts and human stories. That's what helps us connect with the true gravity of the event. But on the flip side, you have to balance fact. You have to rely strictly on official accident reports from agencies like the NCSB or ICAO, alongside expert interviews for technical credibility. If you lean too far into the emotion, it becomes melodramatic. Lean too far into the facts, it gets cold and overly clinical. So, to maintain that perfect balance, documentary makers follow a strict set of ethical guardrails. First off, they have to prioritize accuracy, using those official reports. And since they obviously can't film the original crash, they use high-quality CGI recreations, but strictly to explain the mechanics, like impact angles or structural failures, rather than relying on wild, dramatized speculation. They also have to maintain a deep ethical sensitivity and a respectful tone at all times. And above all else, the story really must focus on the safety improvements that resulted from the tragedy. Make no mistake, these are absolutely non-negotiable rules of the genre. Which brings us to one final provocative thought to leave you with today. If the true villain in these narratives is the failure itself, how do these stories help us build a safer future? Well, by structuring pure chaos into a clear, educational narrative, these documentaries do so much more than just entertain us. They completely demystify the incredible science of aviation safety, and they remind us that every single technical improvement in the sky today was hard-won. Ultimately, structuring tragedy into these highly meticulous, respectful narratives is exactly how we honor the lost, by ensuring their legacy is a safer future for all of us. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and I really hope this changes the way you watch these fascinating documentaries going forward.